This is the fourth and final part of the videos looking at a summary of processes and ideas within evolutionary processes leading to speciation, and this one is going to look at patterns of evolution and also timing of evolution. So the first thing that we're going to look at are the different patterns of evolution. Now remember, when we're looking at these patterns of evolution, timing of evolution, that also applies alongside the allopatric and sympatric speciation, as well as the other ideas we've been talking about. So none of these ideas behind evolution are exclusive of each other. They are all aspects of the same thing that is happening. So for example, when we were looking at allopatric and sympatric speciation in the last video, that was just the idea about whether a geographical barrier was involved or not in terms of generating a new species. But now we're kind of looking about the direction that evolution occurs. Okay, so both of these can actually occur simultaneously. It's just like looking at slightly different aspects of evolution that is occurring. When we look at the timing of evolution, that also kind of goes hand in hand a little bit with these patterns of evolution as well. So all of these definitions you need to have under your belt. You need to be able to generate them when you need to without almost having to think about it, and then you need to incorporate all of these things together to answer the questions in full detail. Okay, so let's look at convergent first down here. So convergent refers to the idea that species originate from different points of origin, but they come together, so they become more similar over time. Generally, this is occurring because these particular organisms live in very similar niches, so they have very similar environmental or very similar selective pressures being placed on them. And the classic example of this is the case in like wings, so talking about insect wings, bat wings. They are obviously not from a reasonably recent similar point of origin, but instead they are evolving a similar function that needs to be carried out for them to succeed well in their niche. And so that means that there is the coming together of structures. So for example, this is where analogous structures comes under this kind of heading of convergent evolution. In contrast to that, divergent evolution is the going away from a similar point of origin. So this refers to the idea that we might start off with a species A, which is shown here, and then if these two populations and then subspecies become separated from each other long enough, using those reproductive isolation mechanisms that we talked about in the last video, and if these two different populations and then subsequently species have different selective pressures placed on them, so this is often due to them now occupying different niches from each other, they can evolve in different directions away from each other. Okay, so that means that they're evolving to adapt to their new niches, and they may not, if they're not similar to each other, then the structures may end up becoming different, or they may end up evolving so differently that they can no longer breed with each other, hence being different species. So species B, species C. This is where ring species comes into play as well. So over time, these species have evolved to be different from each other, and then in the ring species idea, it's when that kind of the sort of ends of those populations come back together and can no longer breed together. Make sure that you look these things up in our notes and textbook that we've been through. As I've said previously many times, this is just a revision exercise. It's not going through these ideas in detail. Another sort of subheading underneath divergent evolution is adaptive radiation, and this refers to the idea that we can have many new species being generated. So here you can see B, C, D, E, F, G are all new species being generated from a common point of origin. Now this often occurs when there is a huge amount of new niches have become available for occupation by new species. And another classic example is talking about mammals taking up a huge number of new niches when the dinosaurs died out and became extinct, or basically their populations were declining. You may notice as we go on to the next slide that this is also kind of goes alongside punctuated equilibrium as well. The last pattern of evolution that we'll look at is coevolution, and this is reasonably familiar because we looked at coevolution when we did the plant and animals achievement standard as well. But this is the idea that two or more species are almost codependent on each other in terms of the pressures provided on them for evolution. So in this case, each species is putting pressure on the other one to evolve in a certain direction. Pollination of flowers is prime example of this. So it could be insects pollinating flowers. They tend to evolve together simply because part of their life cycle depends upon the other species. So therefore, if one of them does not evolve or doesn't keep up with the evolution of the other species, then they are not going to be as successful. Another example in New Zealand is the Perilla tree and the wood pigeon, which is also a pollination example, but it's just a nice example to have here as a New Zealand case study. Just before we move on to timing of evolution, I just forgot to mention about homologous structures. So this is where homologous structures would come into play. The idea that the species have evolved away from each other with divergent evolution, but their structures are still reasonably similar to each other simply because they come from a common point of origin. And that is also the case in adaptive radiation. And this is where you would apply that understanding about the pentadactyl limb. So all of these letters out here could represent different mammalian species, for example, and you can see how that four-limb structure is very similar in all of these different organisms, even though they have quite different function to each other. The last aspect that we're going to look at in terms of patterns and timing evolution is about the timing of evolution. So looking at two different mechanisms in place, gradualism and also punctuated equilibrium. So both of these occur in different situations. It is not that one is more accurate than the other. Gradualism tends to take place when there is a very stable environment. So when the selective pressures are not very intense, and it means that very small changes within a species are accumulated over a long period of time. So any change in allele frequency will take place over a very, very long time. It's quite difficult to see the changes that are occurring in a short period of time. A New Zealand example is the Milliganii shrub, and it is simply that the shrub had very, very small accumulated changes over time because it was living in a very stable habitat, a very stable niche. Punctuated equilibrium, on the other hand, is the concept that there are periods of rapid change and often rapid speciation, so for example adaptive radiation, occurring in a very short period of time, still generations, but in terms of evolution it's a short period of time, and then that would be followed by periods of stasis or periods where not much change occurs at all. So that's why we get this much different looking phylogenetic tree here in comparison to this one up here. So it's this idea that these horizontal lines on this phylogenetic tree represent speciation or new new morphology or new features coming about within those species, and then the vertical lines represent a reasonably stable evolutionary period for that particular species. Whereas up in this phylogenetic tree here for gradualism, it kind of shows that there are much smaller changes and they accumulate over a longer period of time. Okay, so these rapid periods of change are often due to major climatic change that can occur. So for example, with New Zealand ice ages, this would have tied in nicely to punctuated equilibrium, simply because the environment was changing a huge amount in a short period of time. You can also have it when looking at, like we did in the previous example, about the dinosaurs declining, and that opened up a huge number of new niches for mammals. And so that is also an example of punctuated equilibrium as well as being adaptive radiation, simply because punctuated equilibrium looks at the timing of the evolution, whereas adaptive radiation looks at how the species are taking up their new niches or becoming different from each other. Another New Zealand example of punctuated equilibrium was the introduction of the Dracophyllum species, which is also another plant into New Zealand. And because this plant did not exist in New Zealand previously, there was a huge number of new niches that became available to it, And so there was a large, a large period of rapid change and new subspecies forming, and then following that there was a longer period of stasis or relative stability. Over on the left, we've got another diagram that shows the differences between gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. So this is this idea of gradualism here. It also shows divergent evolution. So it's the idea that these changes that are accumulated over time are very small, and you can actually trace back, almost like steps, tracing back within each species to a common point of origin. But it's reasonably apparent here that these small changes over time lead to two new species being formed. So that would be gradualism. Punctuated equilibrium here is this idea that you have quite significant change early on, or quite significant change all at once. So as well as being new species being generated, it can actually be that the morphological changes that occur to a greater degree in a small period of time, and then there is a relative period of stability within that particular species. So you can see here that while in the gradualism model, this particular sort of orange-coloured butterfly occurred over a larger period of time, a number of generations. In the punctuated equilibrium model, you might have an orange butterfly being generated in a very short period of time, but then it remains reasonably stable within that particular environment. This brown and white coloured butterfly, you can see, has also come about in a reasonably rapid frame of time, but once again stable for periods of time also. The other interesting thing about punctuated equilibrium is that technically you can actually end up with the original species coexisting alongside new species. So whereas with gradualism you have an original species turning into two new species, punctuated equilibrium allows for the original species to coexist alongside the two new ones there as well. Just because this model says that there is a lot of rapid change at one time where speciation occurs. So you can see here that there was the differentiating between those two species early on, and then they remain relatively stable throughout time. So that's pretty much it. That's the timing of evolution. And remember, as I said previously, you have to link all of these things together. So you can't just talk about timing of evolution or patterns or the modes of speciation either. So you have to kind of link all these ideas together when you're presented with a question and you think to yourself, is this allopatric or sympatric? Is this divergent? Is it coevolution? Is it convergent evolution? Is it adaptive radiation? Is it gradualism? Is it punctuated equilibrium? So all of these factors can apply to a case study and a question that you are given, and it's just that going through this we've been looking at different aspects of evolution and speciation, and hopefully these 4 videos have been a little bit of use to you.